The memorial was scheduled for the 3rd of the month. The second reclamation fleet arrived on the 1st. That timing seemed deliberate, but it wasn't. The Veldrani didn't do symbolic timing, they did mathematics and logistics. The arrival date was a function of transit distance and fleet doctrine, not theater. But the people who had survived the first battle at Korreth Station and had stayed to build what came after were not entirely rational about timing, and when the second reclamation fleet's transit shadow appeared on the passive censusers 40 hours before the anniversary ceremony, several of them stood in the corridor outside the command center for a long time without speaking. Korreth Vel was among them. She had arrived 4 days earlier. She was a historian, and she noticed the timing and wrote it down. The stones were wrong. That was the first thing Korreth Vel noticed when she stepped off the transport at Korreth Station, 7 years after the massacre. The memorial plaques weren't carved from the basalt that Terran tradition demanded. They were pressed from the hull plating of what had survived the battle, scored slabs of Terran ferrosteel, stamped with names in cold white paint rather than etched deep. They had been made in haste by people who hadn't yet stopped shaking. 7 years later, nobody had replaced them. That was deliberate. Korreth Station had decided the improvised stones were more honest than anything a monument commission could order. Korreth Vel was not a soldier. She held no rank in the Terran Expeditionary Command, carried no sidearm, and wore the plain gray coat of the Historical Accords Documentation Corps. The body charged with assembling the verified record of humanity's wars. Across the outer reaches, she had documented the siege of Yeraveth, the Pallid incursion, the 3-year grinding horror of the Daskori Belt campaign. She had stood in the corridors of recovered transports and counted the handprints left in dried blood on the bulkheads. She was good at the work. She was not a person who wept at memorial services. She wept anyway at Korreth. 4,412 names. The crew of the 14th Terran Expeditionary Group, 6 warships, 6 captains, and every engineer, gunner, medic, cook, and junior signals technician who had been assigned to the station defense ring 7 years ago when the Veldrani Compact's first reclamation fleet dropped out of compressed transit 40,000 kilometers from the station's outer marker. The Veldrani had given Korreth Station exactly 1 hour to surrender. When that hour expired, when the station's commander, Admiral Petra Rusk, had transmitted the single-word reply that became the most quoted line in contemporary Terran military history, the Veldrani had deployed 811 ships and erased the 14th group in 4 minutes and 37 seconds. The station itself had survived because the 14th group's 6 ships had positioned themselves as a screen between the Veldrani guns and the civilian docking rings. They burned in place. 47,000 civilians and support personnel evacuated while the 14th group died. Admiral Rusk's one-word reply was no. Korreth Vel was here to document the 7th anniversary commemoration. She was also here because Korreth Station had become, 8 months ago, the center of the most significant fleet deployment in Terran history since the armistice and the historical accord had determined that what was about to happen at Korreth deserved a witness before, during, and after. A historian who could set down, cleanly and without strategic obfuscation, precisely what had taken place and why. She carried a recorder, a notebook in which she still wrote in longhand, and the classified operational briefings that Expeditionary Command had granted her access to because someone senior had decided that whatever was coming needed to be understood by people who would still be alive a century from now. What was coming was the second reclamation fleet of the Veldrani Compact. 847 ships, the largest single Veldrani deployment since the Compact had been founded 300 years ago. The intelligence estimate put them at 8 days out from Korreth Station when Korreth Vel arrived, the transport's engines cycling down and the docking clamps taking hold with the familiar thump of arrival. 7 days. The intelligence estimate had been wrong by 1 day. She had 1 week to stand in the station's corridors and interview the people preparing to fight in sight of the stones. Korreth Station was a transit hub, a logistics node across 12 outer systems. It was not, in any military sense, a fortress. Its defenses were adequate against piracy and single-ship incursions. They were not adequate against 847 warships. Its civilian population was 31,000. The drills Commodore Soane had been running could now clear everyone in 71 minutes. He had designed everything around that number. The INS Immovable was anchored 30 kilometers off the outer marker, where it could seize everything and be seen by everything that came. It didn't look, from transport distance, like a ship preparing to fight 847 warships. It looked like a ship that was exactly where it intended to be. The station commander now was not Admiral Rusk. Rusk had died at Korreth. Her personal log had been recovered from the battle debris 2 years after the fact, sealed in one of the 6 ships' hardened black boxes, which were the only things the Veldrani's weapons hadn't been able to fully vaporize. Sareth Vel had read that log in its entirety before making this trip. Rusk's log ran for 19 months of daily entries, and then it ended with an entry made 4 hours before the Veldrani ultimatum arrived, which read, "Fleet in position. Evacuation protocols confirmed with station command." Weather is clear, a phrase that had no meteorological meaning in space and that everyone who had read the log assumed was Rusk's way of saying that she had looked at what was coming and made her decision without ambiguity. The current station commander was Commodore David Soane, a compact Terran man of 60 with a permanent look of careful calculation behind his eyes, as if he was always running a sum that wasn't coming out right. Sareth Vel met him on the Memorial Plaza 3 hours after her arrival. He was standing in front of the 4th panel, the crew list of INS Endurance, the last of the 6 ships to die, and he wasn't reading the names. He was simply standing there with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the ferrosteel surface, the way you look at something you're memorizing rather than something you're seeing for the first time. "Commodore," she introduced herself. He knew who she was. The Historical Accord's presence had been approved at the highest level. He nodded without turning from the panel. "She's already in position," he said. He didn't specify who. He didn't need to. INS Immovable. The one Terran warship currently stationed at Korreth. A Citadel-class Dreadnought, 740 meters of layered Terran ferrosteel and reactive composite armor, 12 primary rail battery arrays, 216-point defense turrets, and the deep engine signature that made Citadel-class hulls sound on a passive sensor sweep like a struck bell, a resonance that the Veldrani had no analog for in their archives and, prior to 7 years ago, had never thought to acquire. She rode at anchor 30 kilometers off the station's outer marker, lit from the distant sun at an angle that made her hull look like a slab of cold iron in the black. One ship, 847 incoming. Sareth Vel did the arithmetic the same way everyone did when they first heard the numbers. The arithmetic came out wrong every time, in the sense that the result was always the same. Nothing about this was survivable for the Terran side. You had to know more than the arithmetic to understand why Commodore Soane was not bothered by this. "Can I ask you about the positioning?" Sareth said. "Ask anything you like." He finally turned from the panel. "That's why they sent you, isn't it? To understand the positioning. To understand everything if possible." Soane looked at her for a moment. "No one understands everything," he said. "But come, I'll show you what I understand." The operational picture was as follows. 7 years after the first attack, the Veldrani Compact had concluded, correctly from a strategic standpoint, that Korreth Station controlled the compressed transit corridor that connected 12 Terran outer systems to the main support network. Hold Korreth and you could cut those 12 systems off from resupply, medical evacuation, and military reinforcement. The 12 systems would wither in approximately 18 months. It was the strategy of a force that had 847 warships and felt no particular pressure to be subtle. The Veldrani Compact were not, by the standards of the outer reaches, especially cruel. They were bureaucratic. They catalogued. They assessed resources, identified optimal acquisition targets, issued formal demands, allowed specified time for compliance, and then executed. Their military doctrine was founded on the principle of overwhelming numerical advantage deployed in a single decisive engagement. They did not do prolonged wars. They did not do sieges, feints, or complex operational deceptions. They sent a fleet the size of a small city and assumed the mathematics would handle the rest. 7 years ago, the mathematics had handled the rest. The thing that Sareth Vel came to understand over the next 4 days of interviews was that Commodore Sohn and the crew of INS Immovable were not disputing the mathematics. They were relying on something the mathematics could not account for. The Veldrani didn't know what the Immovable was. The Compact maintained an extensive catalogue of every known military asset of every species they had engaged with in their 300-year history, the reasonable certainty of a bureaucratic military tradition that had never once been surprised by a weapon it hadn't known existed. Their Terran military file was 27 years old. 27 years ago, the largest Terran hull in the outer reaches was the Endurance class, which the Compact's analysts had assessed as structurally unable to sustain engagement against concentrated superior fire. That assessment had been correct. The 14th group had demonstrated it with extreme clarity. The Citadel class had been designed after Korreth, in direct response to Korreth, in a room full of people who had watched 6 ships burn in 4 minutes and 37 seconds. The engineers who built it had known, at every stage of design, exactly what it was being built to kill. There were 3 in commission: INS Immovable, INS Resolute, INS Warranted, and the Veldrani catalogue had no entry for any of them. Planning the second reclamation fleet, the Compact's intelligence section had flagged an anomalous hull signature. Probable new heavy combatant. Insufficient data for classification. Recommend caution if encountered. They assessed it as likely an endurance variant with enhanced shielding and set the engagement doctrine accordingly. If encountered, engage with concentrated leading-edge fire before the target can bring its weapons to bear. Standard doctrine. The doctrine they had used 7 years ago. The doctrine that had erased 6 Endurance-class hulls in 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Sareth Vel found this sequence of events. The Veldrani building their confidence on what they had learned at Korreth, and Korreth being precisely the thing that had destroyed that confidence's foundation to be the most significant fact in the entire operational picture. The version she finally kept in her notebook read, they had studied Korreth's lesson. They drew the wrong conclusion. 3 days before the second reclamation fleet arrived, Sareth Vel spent 2 hours with Commander Laya Osu, the Immovable's executive officer. Osu was 41, with the habitual stillness of someone who had learned long ago to conserve motion. She had been at Korreth 7 years ago, not on any of the 6 ships that died, but on the station itself, 11 years old, in the civilian evacuation stream, watching 6 Terran warships burn through a small window. The Veldrani have never fought a Citadel class at full operational profile, Osu said. They destroyed the Endurance-class ships at Korreth 7 years ago. Smaller guns, older armor, single-layer reactive composite versus the Citadel's triple-stacked. The Endurance class were screening ships. They did what screening ships do. She paused. They screened, and the Citadel class does something different. The Citadel class doesn't move, Osu said. That's not a figure of speech. It is not a ship you put in your battle line and maneuver. It is a ship you put in a corridor and tell to hold it. She turned back to Sarath. Captain Rennick has been running simulations for 11 weeks. The optimal position for a single Citadel class against an incoming fleet of this scale is directly on the axis of their transit corridor approach, stationary at a distance that forces them to commit to engagement range before they can maneuver around the station. She stopped. I want to be honest with you about the numbers, because you're the historian and the numbers are going to matter. Please. 847 ships against 1 isn't a battle, Osu said. By every model in our doctrine library, it's not even a decision. A Citadel class can track and engage 104 targets simultaneously across its primary battery arrays. It can maintain point defense coverage across a 200-kilometer engagement sphere. Its reactive armor is rated to sustain heavy weapons fire for, under normal operational projections, approximately 40 minutes before primary hull integrity begins degrading. She paused again. What the simulations say is that Immovable holds the corridor and takes the engagement for 53 minutes before the Veldrani fleet achieves sufficient flanking angles to begin degrading our fire control. During those 53 minutes, at the rate of engagement that their fleet doctrine requires them to maintain, they have to advance. They can't sit in range and be hit. They have to push through. Our projections say we remove between 380 and 410 of their ships. Sareth Vel did that arithmetic too. That still leaves them over 400. Yes, Osu said. It does. So why? Because they don't know any of that, Osu said flatly. When they drop out of transit and scan the corridor, they will see one Terran warship of a class they have incomplete records on, anchored in front of a station that already surrendered once, defending 12 outer systems that are not going to send reinforcements, because there are no reinforcements available. She looked at Sareth steadily. What they'll think is, this is a screening ship. The same class of mistake they made 7 years ago, only reversed. The silence in the compartment was the kind that has weight, and when they realize it isn't, Sareth said. Osu's expression didn't change. By then, she said, they'll be committed. The morning after the Osu interview, Sareth Vel arrived early at the Immovable's signals compartment. The room was narrow, lined with acoustic dampening panels, and a wall of monitoring equipment that ran at a low continuous hum, the sound of a room that was always listening. Lieutenant Saris Edrin met her, 34, an academic background in the non-standard communication systems of non-Terran species, 6 years of sitting in rooms that listened and interpreting what the listening returned. She had spent her first 3 months aboard building out the Immovable's Veldrani cipher decryption library. We went in with about 60% of their active cipher rotation, she told Sareth. 60% means we can decrypt most standard fleet communication within 2 to 4 minutes of intercept. The remaining 40% is a mix of emergency protocols, fleet-to-fleet command ciphers, and what we think are new rotation keys they introduced after the first Reclamation Fleet's engagement. We haven't cracked those yet. Does that gap matter for what's coming? Edrin considered it. In a high-intensity engagement, the Veldrani signal discipline tends to degrade under pressure. The protocols are good, but maintaining cipher rotation when your ships are taking casualties requires people who are doing nothing else. If the formation is breaking, if the engagement isn't going the way the doctrine projects, the cipher maintenance stops being anyone's first priority. She looked at the monitoring wall. So yes, the 60% matters, but it may not be the 60% that tells us the most. Sometimes it's the breakdown in the remaining 40 that's clear signal. What are you listening for? Timing changes, protocol gaps, encryption failures. When a fleet that runs on careful bureaucratic process starts losing its process, you can hear it. The intervals change. The authentication windows slip. The cipher keys stop rotating on schedule. A fleet that's been doing things the same careful way for 300 years makes a very specific sound when something happens that its procedures can't contain. If the Immovable holds and fires for the first 30 minutes, we'll hear it. They'll know something is wrong with their model before they know what the model got wrong. Sareth wrote that evening. One room tells you what the ship can absorb. The other tells you when the people trying to destroy it have stopped believing they can. 2 evenings before the fleet was due, Sareth spent 15 minutes with Petty Officer 2nd Class Devra Sol, the Immovable's senior rail battery control operator. Sol was 26 and had been operating rail battery systems since she was 22. She met Sareth in the forward battery control room, which smelled of ozone and cooling composite, 3 of its stations running pre-engagement cycling protocols on the battery arrays. The question going into an engagement like this isn't whether the guns work. They work. The question is the heat cycling. At sustained maximum output, the rail channels develop thermal stress points that accumulate. Push a battery past its thermal ceiling and you get rail fracture. A fractured rail doesn't fire, and it compromises the adjacent rails as it fails. So you rotate, 2 arrays cool while 10 fire. It's standard high-intensity doctrine. But the doctrine was written against engagements projected to last 40 minutes, maybe 60. The simulations Rennick has been running project this one at 90 to 100. What happens at 90 minutes? Nobody has ever run a 100-minute sustained engagement. The math holds. I've checked it 8 times. But the thermal modeling past 90 minutes is extrapolation, not tested data. The arrays will hold. I'll be watching the signatures in real time and adjusting the rotation intervals manually if the numbers climb. She had also spoken, briefly, with the Immovable's chief engineer, a heavyset man named Senior Chief Warrant Officer Pol Danik, who had 32 years in Terran engineering service. He had spent 2 minutes saying something she wrote down verbatim the moment he left. He had said, "People keep asking me if I'm scared. I tell them I'm not. I'm not lying to them. I'm not scared. I'm ready. There's a difference. Fear is when you don't know what's coming. I've read the specs. I've checked the hull. I know what's coming, and I know what this ship can take. My job is to make sure she gives back everything she's supposed to give back." He had picked up his inspection kit. She will. The day before the fleet arrived, Sareth Vel spent the late morning in the navigation section with Lieutenant Commander Ferris Ole, the ship's senior navigation officer. Ole had spent her first 3 months aboard unlearning the impulse to steer. On most warships, the navigation team keeps the ship in position during fluid engagement, continuous adjustment, course corrections. On the Immovable, my job is to not move. That sounds simple. It isn't. Every incoming impact transfers kinetic energy. Even with the reactive composite absorbing most of it, some of it moves the ship. A small fraction of a degree of drift over 90 minutes accumulates. If the Immovable drifts 3 degrees off the corridor axis, the primary battery firing solutions change. The geometry the simulations optimized assumes we stay within a 300-meter envelope for the duration. My job is to keep us there. Every time we drift, the thrusters compensate, while the ship is being hit. Yes, the ship being hit is what creates the drift. I have 2 operators with me. We cross-check every correction before it executes. We have 11 seconds between impact detection and correction burn, enough to verify the calculation and confirm the output. 11 seconds. That's the margin. She pulled up a sub-display. Were you at Korreth? I was at the Discovery belt. I put in the transfer when the posting opened. This corridor is going to stay open. The morning after that conversation, Sareth Vel accompanied Danek on a portion of his pre-engagement inspection. The inspection ran for 4 hours, through every section of the ship's lower decks, the secondary power relay junctions, the damage control equipment bays, the intermediate hull monitoring stations where technicians watched the reactive composite layer's pressure readings in real time. At each station, Danek spoke to the crew member present in the same short, precise register, economical, the way a man speaks when he has checked the same systems for 32 years and doesn't need ceremony to be thorough. At one checkpoint, a young technician named Specialist Harrow was cross-referencing the live readouts against the baseline specifications Danek had filed at the start of the 3-month Korreth posting. Danek paused longer there than he had anywhere else. "Number 7 panel," Danek said. "Yes, Senior Chief." Harrow had the baseline report already open. 0.4 deviation from baseline, inside tolerance, but it's been climbing since week 8 of the posting. "Not climbing," Danek said. "Trending. There's a difference." He made a mark in his log. "Flag it for post-engagement priority review. If the trend continues through the engagement and we're still here to do the review, I want this panel on the first inspection cycle." Yes, Senior Chief, he was not a worried man. He had found a data point that was inside tolerance and trending, and he had addressed it in the correct procedural way. The difference between fear and readiness operating in real time. She asked him, at a later checkpoint, where he had been when the first reclamation fleet hit Korreth 7 years ago. Repair bay on the Gallant, supply tender. 40,000 kilometers from Korreth Station when it happened. We got the evacuation transports on our sensors about 8 minutes in. The debris field from the 14th group was readable about 20 minutes in. I put in my Citadel-class transfer request 6 months later. Took 3 years to come through. Why the Citadel-class specifically? Because somebody had to be inside whatever they built next. I wanted to make sure whoever was inside it had done their job on the hull. He checked the next readout, so I made sure. She wrote, "The inspection was routine. The ship is not routine. That coexistence is what the ship is for." On the day before the fleet was projected to arrive, Sareth reviewed the account she had assembled. She had interviewed 14 people over 4 days. The station's chief medical officer, a gray-haired woman named Eston Var, had said, with precision, "The station stayed because they chose to. Every person here had the option of reassignment. None of them took it. That is not a medical outcome. That is a decision. I'm telling you about it because it belongs in the record." One of the residents, a supply logistics supervisor named Marin Toth, had been 11 years old during the evacuation. He was 18 when the station reopened, came back as a volunteer cargo handler, and had never left. He was 29 now. "Were you afraid?" Sareth had asked him. Toth had thought about it. "I don't think afraid is the right word," he said finally. "I knew what the Veldrani were going to do when they came back. Everyone here knew. Sohn was transparent about it. He gave everyone the full picture, the fleet size, the timing, everything. He didn't want anyone staying who didn't understand what staying meant. I understood what it meant. I stayed anyway. Why?" The pause again. "Because there are 4,412 names on those panels," he said, "and I'm here. And the only thing that makes that make sense to me is if being here means something." 2 nights before the fleet arrived, Sareth Vel went back to the Memorial Plaza alone at 300 station time. She had interviewed 3 station survivors who had been in the command center when the Veldrani ultimatum arrived. All 3 described the same moment. The ultimatum transmitted, the countdown timer running, the room quiet. Rusk sitting at the command console with both hands flat on the surface, and then the single word, spoken aloud first, to the room, before she transmitted it, not dramatic, not raised, just clear and certain, the way you state a fact that was never really in question. She wrote in her notebook in the quiet, the word was enough, everything afterward was also the word. 12 hours before the second reclamation fleet arrived, Sareth Vel was aboard INS Immovable. Commodore Sohn had authorized it, with the understanding that she was a civilian observer, that she was not to be in a combat station, and that she would be in the secondary briefing compartment with a direct feed to the tactical display and a hardened recorder. The ship was 740 meters of purposeful mass, and it was, as Osu had said, stationary, not drifting, not in a holding pattern, anchored in space at the precise coordinates that the 11 weeks of simulations had identified, oriented bow first toward the transit corridor, its 12 primary rail battery arrays deployed and locked. The passive sensor net was reading the approach vector of a fleet-scale mass in compressed transit, the distinctive spatial distortion signature of 900-plus ships in coordinated transit, which the Veldrani produced because their fleet doctrine required them to arrive simultaneously. On the tactical display, the mass appeared as a gradient shift, a shadow in the fabric of compressed space. It was 37 minutes out. The display's countdown was running. Captain Rennick was 55, gray-haired, economical of expression. She had been at Korreth 7 years ago, not in the battle, but in the recovery operation 18 months later, helping pull the ferrosteel panels from the recovered plating and hand them to the crew, who pressed them into memorial stones. On the bridge, she stood at the central station with her hands clasped behind her back, the same cultivated stillness Sohn used. The crew was at full station, every person at a post, 22 minutes. The Veldrani Compact's second reclamation fleet dropped out of compressed transit at 14/7/44 station time, 7 years, 2 months, and 11 days after the first reclamation fleet had destroyed the 14th Terran Expeditionary Group. They came out of transit in their standard formation, a leading edge of 216 fast patrol ships, followed by the main body of 408 medium combat vessels, followed by the 83 fleet carriers and the 140 heavy cruisers of the rear echelon. It was a formation optimized for rapid advance and sequential commitment, the leading edge to locate and fix the target, the main body to overwhelm it, the rear echelon to mop up and assert positional control. It was the same formation they had used 7 years ago. Their leading edge's sensors completed their initial sweep in 11 seconds. The sweep returned 1 contact, a single Terran warship of an unclassified heavy hull type, stationary on the axis of their approach, 32,000 kilometers from the station's outer marker. In the Veldrani Fleet's command archive, the contact registered as Terran warship, hull class unknown, mass exceeds standard catalogue Terran heavy combatant by factor of 2.7, no match in active records. Fleet Admiral Tevrak, commanding the second reclamation fleet from the bridge of his flagship, received the scan data 17 seconds after transit emergence. The anomaly note, mass exceeds standard, was flagged by his tactical officer as a possible sensor artifact, calibration error. The previous Terran fleet at Korreth had consisted of Endurance-class hulls. Tevrak ordered a second scan. The second scan returned the same result. One contact, stationary, mass approximately 2.7 times the largest Terran heavy combatant in their catalogue, no active weapons signature, no attempt to maneuver. Tevrak ordered his leading edge to advance. The leading edge began its advance at 14:9:23. On the secondary compartment's tactical display, Sareth Vel watched the 216 ship formation accelerate toward INS Immovable's position. The sounds of the Immovable around her were the ship's operational sounds, the hum of the primary rail battery power systems cycling to pre-fire charge, the ventilation, the periodic status reports transmitted over the internal net, normal sounds, working sounds, the sounds of a ship being entirely itself. At 14:11:8, the Immovable's tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Hresh, reported the leading edge at engagement range for the primary rail batteries. Captain Rennick said, "Fire." The 12 primary rail battery arrays fired in a coordinated sequence that took 4.3 seconds. 12 arrays, 6 guns each, 3 rounds per minute, firing in staggered pairs to prevent power bus saturation, which produced a sustained rate of output that the Veldrani's tactical doctrine had no category for, because the Veldrani's largest catalogued Terran weapon platform produced approximately 1/7 of this volume at equivalent range. The leading edge took the first salvo at 14:11:13. 17 of the leading edge's forward ships ceased to exist in the first salvo. Not disabled, not damaged, the railgun rounds at that range, from a Citadel-class battery, carried kinetic energy that the Veldrani's standard-issue patrol ship armor could not disperse. The rounds passed through. 17 ships became debris clouds in 4.3 seconds. Fleet Admiral Tevrak received the damage report 38 seconds later. The report, translated literally, read approximately: leading edge contact, 17 units destroyed in first exchange. Terran weapon signature does not match any catalogued system. Rate of fire. Classified as impossible under current doctrine. Recommend clarification of orders. Tevrak's response was to order the leading edge to scatter and the main body to begin engagement advance. Standard doctrine for encountering a high-intensity fixed position. You spread the target surface area to reduce the effectiveness of concentrated fire, and you push the main body forward to overwhelm. This was the first decision that cost him. On the tactical display, Sareth watched the formation shift, 216 ships scattering across an engagement volume that now spanned 400 kilometers. The Immovable's point defense sphere, 216 turrets covering a 200-kilometer radius activated. On the bridge feed, she heard Hresh's voice, flat and professional, point defense engaging dispersed leading edge, tracking 201 contacts, 19 outside optimal engagement range, flagging for primary battery attention. The point defense turrets were designed to kill incoming munitions, the torpedoes, guided rounds, and fragmentation packages enemy ships fired. But at close range, against the Veldrani's lightly armored patrol ships, they were effective in a way the Veldrani had no reference for, because the Veldrani had never been in close engagement range of a Citadel class before. The leading edge's dispersal maneuver, intended to reduce their exposure to the primary batteries, had pushed them into the point defense envelope. At 14:18:41, 31 minutes into the engagement, the leading edge's surviving elements, 83 ships, down from 216, broke formation and began withdrawal. They had taken 33% casualties. They were broadcasting a distress code that the Immovable's signals team translated and logged. The Veldrani equivalent of "we did not know what this was." One Veldrani patrol ship did not withdraw. It turned perpendicular to the withdrawal vector and accelerated toward the Immovable, crossing directly in front of the bow at close range, broadcasting on every Veldrani fleet frequency simultaneously, a range-finding broadcast, a continuous targeting pulse that would let the Veldrani Fleet Command use the ship's position as a reference datum for recalibrating their engagement geometry. The Immovable's point defense sphere eliminated the ranging ship at 14:14:52. The traverse had lasted 91 seconds. In those 91 seconds, the Veldrani main body had updated its fire control models with the Immovable's precise position, which produced, at 14:16, the first coordinated torpedo salvo from the main body, 312 torpedoes on a convergent approach vector, arriving in a grouped wave. The point defense sphere intercepted 289 of 312. 23 reached the Immovable's hull. 19 impacted the reactive composite outer layer and dispersed within it. 4 penetrated to the intermediate layer. Warrant Officer Danik's voice on the net, calm and specific, directed his teams to the 4 impact points. Intermediate layer integrity holding, repair teams on site, no primary system impact. The Veldrani Main Body Fleet Command issued a second coordinated salvo order. The order went out to 408 ships. The ships fired. The Immovable's point defense sphere was already cycling back to full operational state. The recovery interval, after a maximum volume salvo, interception was 40 seconds, and the Veldrani's tactical doctrine specified a minimum 45-second salvo preparation interval. This was not luck. It was a specification written into the Citadel-class design by engineers who had known exactly what doctrine the ship would eventually face, because it was the same doctrine that had killed 6 Endurance-class hulls 7 years ago. The second coordinated salvo intercepted at 91%. 12 impacts, outer layer only, the main body didn't slow down. Tevrak's order to advance was already in motion, and 408 ships in a coordinated advance cannot be recalled quickly. This was the second cost. The main body arrived at primary rail battery range at 14:22:17. The Immovable fired. Korreth Vel wrote in her notebook while the tactical display filled with contact designators going dark. 408 ships in coordinated advance. 1 ship, stationary, firing. At the 12-minute mark of the main body engagement, the Immovable had fired 4,080 primary railgun rounds, and approximately 163 Veldrani main body ships were destroyed. At 14:30:00, 23 minutes in, the Immovable's status showed primary battery cycling at 94% efficiency, point defense sphere intact, hull integrity at 100%. The Veldrani main body had been designed to push through a fixed position by volume of fire, burning through its defense capacity the way you burn through a wall by concentrating heat. The model had worked in every engagement the Veldrani had conducted for 300 years. The Citadel's defense architecture wasn't a wall, it was a filter. The reactive composite armor's layered design dissipated incoming energy across a larger surface area than any previous Terran hull. The point defense sphere was catching approximately 92% of incoming Veldrani torpedoes and guided munitions before they reached the hull. The 8% that penetrated were hitting armor rated to absorb 4 times their yield. The Veldrani main body was putting everything it had into the engagement. The engagement was going in one direction. Korreth Vel wrote at 14:33, "They cannot understand what they are seeing. Their doctrine says a fixed position, subject to this volume of fire for this duration, is destroyed. The position is not destroyed." She stopped and looked at the tactical display for a long moment. Then she wrote, "I think I understand what Rennick meant by the bill." At 14:37:52, Korreth's recorder picked up a transmission on the open Veldrani fleet channel, unencrypted, which was itself significant because you transmitted unencrypted when you had stopped caring who was listening. The translation read, "This warship is not in our records. Advance is suspended. All units hold current position and await updated threat assessment." Tevrak was trying to stop the advance. He was too late. 408 ships in a coordinated advance cannot be recalled quickly, and the cipher discipline that should have carried the order cleanly had already begun to fail. The rear echelon of the Second Reclamation Fleet, 83 fleet carriers and 140 heavy cruisers, had been advancing at Fleet Doctrine Standard spacing since 14:09:23. At Tevrak's suspension order, they were 19 minutes from primary battery engagement range. Their advance could be slowed but not halted at that spacing. Without the risk of collision mass in the fleet formation, the carriers and heavy cruisers were too large, their approach velocities too committed. Commodore Sohn, monitoring from Korreth Station's command center, transmitted a single-line update to Korreth compartment at 14:54:08, rear echelon committed. Estimate 11 minutes. The main body by 14:54:08 had taken losses its tactical modeling had categorized as engagement unsustainable, withdrawal advised. The surviving 209 main body ships were in a disordered semi-withdrawal, attempting to open range from the Immovable's primary batteries. They were not retreating cleanly. Veldrani doctrine did not include a clean retreat protocol for an engagement of this type, because an engagement of this type had never appeared in their models. They moved in overlapping arcs, some accelerating across other ships' withdrawal vectors. The engagement volume was full of ships that no longer knew their positions relative to doctrine. What was left was mass trying to find safe distance from a thing that had not stopped firing in 47 minutes. 7 years ago, the 14th Terran Expeditionary Group had burned in 4 minutes and 37 seconds. At 14:54:8, the Second Reclamation Fleet had been in engagement contact for 47 minutes and had lost 291 ships. The Immovable was still firing. The rear echelon came into primary battery range at 15:05:31. Sareth Vel stopped writing. She became aware, at some point, that her pen was motionless and that she was watching the tactical display with the full focused attention she had spent 12 years training herself out of. She had documented 14 significant fleet engagements. She had never lost observer distance before. The heavy cruisers were significantly harder to kill than the patrol ships or the medium combat vessels. Their armor was designed to absorb kinetic impact, and it took between 3 and 7 rounds per heavy cruiser to achieve hull breach. But the Immovable had 12 arrays and a cycle rate, and the heavy cruisers were advancing into it because they had no other option. The fleet carriers were not hard to kill, large, slow, their armor designed to resist fighter munitions, not railgun rounds from a Citadel-class primary battery. 3 decks below the secondary compartment, Senior Medical Officer Lyra Tyen had no tactical feed. Only a casualty board, 4 operating tables, a team of 9, and the sound of the ship telling her what the engagement was doing. She had spent 11 weeks drilling the specific sequence of a 90-minute sustained engagement rather than a short, sharp action. The first casualty came at 14:19:7, Specialist 3rd Class Marinosi, 23, from the Point Defense section near the outer hull. The breach had sealed as designed. The kinetic transfer through the plating at that proximity had killed her. The second, Senior Technical Operator Dio Achil, came in at 15:08:44, the aft sensor array impact, in the precise location that absorbed the most concentrated energy transfer. Between them, 11 more crew came in with injuries that did not require surgery. The operating tables were never empty for more than 4 minutes. Tyen spoke to Sareth 2 days after the battle. The 2 we lost were not lost because something failed that should have worked. They were in specific locations when specific impacts occurred, and in those locations nothing in the design could have changed the outcome. The hull held everywhere it was rated to hold. The 2 we lost were outside those margins. That's what I want in the record, because the people who design the next ship need to know what the margins were and where they ended. Inside the ship, the rear echelon engagement had a different character. The vibration in the deck plating changed, a deeper, more persistent resonance. The arrays cycling at a rate pushing the power systems into a register Sareth had not felt before. Through the internal net she could hear Sol calling rotation intervals, shorter than standard, in a voice that was steady and fully present. She was doing the thing, not watching herself do it. At 15:11, the power management team flagged a draw on the primary bus 3% above the projected ceiling. Sol adjusted her rotation sequence by 4 seconds per array pair. The draw returned to within 2%, 4 seconds. The 4 seconds were not in any doctrine manual. They were in Sol's head, derived from 11 weeks of drill and the previous hour of live data. The gap between the extrapolation and the tested fact, closed in real time by a 26-year-old who had told a historian 3 days ago that she believed the arrays would hold, they held. At 15:19:44, 73 minutes after the Veldrani Second Reclamation Fleet had dropped out of transit, Fleet Admiral Tevrak transmitted a general withdrawal order on every channel the Immovable's signals team was monitoring. The surviving elements of the Second Reclamation Fleet, 206 ships across all 3 echelons, plus the 83 surviving leading-edge elements that had withdrawn 40 minutes earlier, began their withdrawal. The Immovable tracked them to the edge of its primary battery range and fired until they were gone. By 1540, the withdrawal of the Veldrani Second Reclamation Fleet was general and irreversible. What had entered the Korreth Transit Corridor as the largest single Veldrani deployment in 3 centuries was leaving it in fragmented groupings. The formational geometry of a fleet dissolved into the dispersal pattern of ships trying to find transit coordinates while still in effective range of a weapon system that had not stopped firing in 93 minutes. The tactical display was showing 589 contact, designators dark, 589 ships. Sereth Vel was writing again. She had started writing again at 1522, at some point during the rear echelon engagement, because the historian's discipline had reasserted itself over the shock of watching the numbers climb. She wrote, "The secondary compartment is warm. The ventilation system is running slightly above ambient to compensate for the additional power. Load. The tactical display is calibrated to show active contacts in blue and destroyed contacts in red, and the display is more than half red. The sounds of the ship have not changed since the engagement began. That is the thing that I will not be able to adequately convey in the formal, historical account. The sounds of the ship are the same. The crew is doing the work. The work sounds like work. This is what it looks like when a debt is paid in full." At 1545, Lieutenant Commander Hresh transmitted a final contact tracking report. No active Veldrani contacts within primary battery range. The last of the withdrawal was beyond engagement distance, accelerating toward compressed transit coordinates. Captain Rennick's voice came over the internal net. "Stand down from battle stations. Good work." Sereth heard someone laugh, somewhere in the ship. Just once, short, involuntary, the laugh that comes out of a person when tension that has been building for 3 months and 98 minutes finally has somewhere to go. Then it was quiet again, the same operational sounds, the work continuing because the work always continued. The Immovable's damage report was complete by 17. The ship had taken 37 weapons impacts to the primary hull. 22 had been absorbed by the reactive composite outer layer without structural penetration. 15 had penetrated to the intermediate layer, producing damage to 8-point defense turret stations, 1 secondary power relay junction, and an external sensor array on the aft section. No primary systems had been damaged. No rail battery arrays had gone offline. The ship's primary hull integrity had not been compromised. 2 crew members were dead. Specialist third-class Marin Osi and senior technical operator Deo Achille. They were the Immovable's first combat fatalities. The Immovable had destroyed 641 Veldrani ships. 206 had withdrawn. Of those, the signals team's analysis projected that 40 to 50 had taken damage that would prevent them from reaching a Veldrani repair facility without emergency assistance. The Second Reclamation Fleet had arrived at Korreth with 847 ships. 155, at most, would reach home. Sereth spent 3 more days aboard, reviewing the signals intelligence the Immovable's team had gathered. The record was a document in fragmentation. In the first 12 minutes, the Veldrani fleet communications were orderly. By the 18-minute mark, the cipher traffic volume had increased by a factor of 4. By the 26th minute, 3 separate fleet commanders had transmitted requests for updated engagement doctrine, the Veldrani equivalent of asking the manual for instructions the manual didn't contain. By the 39th minute, the unencrypted broadcasts had begun. She found the moment she was looking for in a transmission from Tevrak's flagship at 14:51:8, 14 minutes before the general suspension order. The transmission, in translation, "What is the classification of the Terran warship?" The tactical officer's reply 31 seconds later. "No classification exists." Tevrak's response. The tactical officer, "It means we have no record of this class. We have no engagement doctrine for this class. We have no projected performance ceiling for this class. We are outside the catalogue. We are outside the catalogue." She spoke with the signals team lead the morning after the battle, senior specialist Tavan Rowe, 28, who had kept meticulous logs. "Standard Veldrani protocol uses a rotating cipher that changes keys every 9 minutes, Rowe told her. The changes happened on schedule through the first 3 rotations. At the 4th, which should have been at 27 minutes, the key change didn't happen. The rotation requires 2 separate command stations to authenticate simultaneously. If the flag officers are processing a situation that doesn't match any scenario in their playbook, the authentication doesn't happen on time. The cipher drifts, then defaults to clear. He closed the logbook. At 26 minutes, Tevrak's command structure had stopped doing standard cipher maintenance. Everyone who would normally handle it was handling something else. Whatever they were expecting an engagement with Terran warships to look like, this wasn't it. And by 26 minutes, they knew that. Sareth noted in her private notebook. At 26 minutes, the people responsible for the cipher keys had looked at what was happening outside and simply forgotten to rotate them, because the rotation was a small administrative task, and the thing happening outside was not small. They had been frightened. She did not write that in the formal account, but she left it in her private notes, because a historian who didn't notice when 847 ships collectively forgot to rotate their cipher keys was missing something about what it means to be a fleet that has stepped outside its own catalogue. On the 3rd day, Sol found her in the forward observation bay. At 81 minutes, Array 4's thermal signature started climbing faster than my rotation model projected. I shortened its interval and bumped Array 7 into its cooling window 6 seconds early, faster than anything we'd ever drilled, because the thermal profile didn't match any scenario in the training data. From that point on, I was adjusting every 12 minutes based on what the arrays were actually doing, not what the model said. The model got us to 81 minutes accurately. After that, it was me and the readouts. She glanced at Sareth. 3 days ago, I told you I believed the arrays would hold. I believed it then. I believe it differently now. Then it was the math. Now it's the fact. There's a difference. She also reviewed the damage report with Danik, who did not describe any of the impacts as close calls. Close call implies the outcome was in doubt. The outer layer held where it was rated to hold. The intermediate layer held where it was rated to hold. Nothing penetrated beyond its rated depth. I built the hull to those specifications. The hull performed to those specifications. A close call is when something happens that the specifications didn't account for. Nothing happened that the specifications didn't account for. He paused. Number 7 panel, the one Harrow flagged in the inspection, came through with no additional deviation. It was a data point that turned out not to matter. Sareth Vel asked to speak with Captain Rennick the following morning. The ship was still anchored at the same position on the transit corridor axis. It had not moved. You could have requested a different posting, Sareth said. Expeditionary Command would have assigned you elsewhere. Rennick looked at the recorder, then at Sareth. There wasn't a different posting. This was the posting. I've been in the service for 31 years. I've read Admiral Rusk's log. I was at Korreth in the recovery operation. I helped press those panels. There's a word people use for what drove us here. They call it vengeance. Something fierce and hot, something that burns through a person and makes them reckless. She shook her head. That's not what it is. Then what is it? It's a bill, Rennick said finally. Rusk said no. The 14th group made good on the no. They died making it good. The bill exists. It has to be paid. We held the corridor. That's what we do. That's what they did. The only difference is we're still here to know that we did it. Sareth wrote that down. The memorial service on the 7th anniversary, deferred by 48 hours, while the station ran safety checks and the Immovable's crew finished their damage work, took place on the 3rd day after the battle. Sareth Vel stood at the back of the crowd of station personnel, military and civilian, arranged in front of the ferrosteel panels, 4,412 names, the photos on the flanking displays. The improvised panels pressed from the plating of ships that had burned. 2 of the photos had changed in the 48 hours since the battle. 2 new photographs added to the lower section of the display, Specialist 3rd Class Marin Osai, Senior Technical Operator Dio Achil. Their families had not been contacted yet. That process took time, but someone had found photographs in the ship's personnel files and added them because the memorial's logic was the same as Admiral Rusk's reply. Without elaboration, without waiting for the official process, simply because it was the right thing and there was no reason to delay it. Before the service, Marin Toth found Sarath at the edge of the plaza. "Did you know either of them?" Sarath asked Osi. "A little. She used to come through the cargo bay on her off hours. The Immovable crew, when they had liberty, sometimes came through just to walk around something that wasn't a warship. She'd sit in the office and drink tea and not really talk." He paused. She was 23. He looked at the panels. The hard part is that the math is still right. 641 to 2. By every measure that matters, what happened was what was supposed to happen. And yet, Osi came through the cargo bay to drink tea and sit somewhere that wasn't a warship. She's in the display now because the corridor needed holding. Both of those things are true. They're both just true. "That," Sarah said quietly, "is going in the record." He nodded once. The service was beginning. They both turned to face the panels. Commodore Sohan spoke briefly, as he always spoke, without flourish, with specificity. He named the 2 new additions before he addressed the 4,412 already recorded. He said, "Specialist 3rd Class Marin Osi, Senior Technical Operator Dio Achille." They held their stations. That is the complete record of what they did. He did not add anything to this. The complete record was enough. Captain Rennick stood to Sohan's left and did not speak. She had spoken. Sarath thought, in the engagement, in the only language that mattered there, the language of 98 minutes of sustained fire that had not once stopped or retreated. She looked at the panels with an expression that Sarath recorded in her notebook as not grief, not pride, not relief, something quieter. Recognition, the look of a person who has paid a debt and knows it was the right debt, and knows also that some portion of the payment cannot be recovered. After the service, Sarath went back to the panel that listed the crew of INS Endurance, the last of the 6 to die, and stood in front of it the way Sohan had stood the day she arrived, not reading, just looking. She thought about the word Rennick had rejected, vengeance, the fierce, hot thing. The bill Rennick had called it, the debt that exists and has to be paid. She thought about the 641 Veldrani ships that would never carry their crews home. And the 2 names now on the memorial display, and 4,412 names on panels made of the ships that had said no. She thought about the Immovable still anchored 30 kilometers off the outer marker, in exactly the same position it had held for 3 months, and through 98 minutes of engagement, its hull bearing the marks of 37 impacts and not a single moment of retreat. In the Historical Accords records, the engagement would be catalogued under the formal designation. Action at Korreth Transit Corridor, Year 7, Post-Compact Incursion. The entry would note, 1 Terran Citadel-class Dreadnought engaged and repelled the Veldrani Second Reclamation Fleet of 847 vessels. Enemy losses 641 confirmed destroyed, additional 40 to 50 projected disabled. Terran losses 2 crew killed, 15 structural impacts within sustainable parameters. Terran force position maintained throughout. The entry would note that the Veldrani Compact transmitted a cessation of operations communication to Terran Expeditionary Command 9 days after the battle, citing unacceptable logistical cost of sustained operations against Korreth Corridor. The entry would not note, because formal documents did not note such things, that Admiral Petra Rusk had said no 7 years ago in a room full of people who understood they were going to die for it, and that the Immovable had been the answer to that no, the long-form elaboration of it, the proof that the word had meant exactly what Rusk intended, and would continue to mean for as long as Terran ships could reach this corridor and hold it. Sarath Vel was a historian. She wrote the formal entry. She also wrote, in her notebook, in handwriting that was not for the official record. The stones were improvised because there was no time for proper ones. 7 years later, the people who survived found them more honest than anything else could have been. I think they were right. The Immovable didn't move. That was the entire answer. Her formal account was submitted to the Historical Accords Review Board 6 weeks after her return. It ran to 41 pages and was approved for the open archive with 2 redactions concerning the Citadel class's armor design. Terran Expeditionary Command distributed it internally as required reading. The Expeditionary Commander wrote her a personal message of 3 sentences. I've read it. So has the fleet. Thank you for being there. 7 years ago, Admiral Rusk had said no. 6 ships had held the line until 47,000 people were clear. The station had stayed open, had been rebuilt, had grown. The Citadel class had been built specifically to be what the Endurance class could not. A ship that didn't screen and burn, but anchored and held. Immovable had been positioned on the corridor axis and had fired for 98 minutes and had not moved, and 641 Veldrani ships had ceased to exist, and 9 days later, the Compact had transmitted its cessation communication, and the 12 outer systems were still connected to the network, and the corridor was still open. One word, spoken in a room full of people who knew what it cost. Everything after that was the same word, in longer form, at larger scale, over 7 years, the continuing elaboration of a refusal that had never been anything other than simple and clear and, once stated, irrevocable. You build what you need. You position it where it has to go. You hold the line. The stones were improvised. They were more honest than anything else could have been. The immovable didn't move. That was the entire answer.